times people struggle with it because if there's one thing I think addicts are good at is trying to control stuff, and especially trying to control our disease. And when I was bottoming out on alcohol, I wanted to have any solution besides giving up drink. And that I could quit smoking. I became a vegan. I got a pet. I got a master's degree because I thought if I go to graduate school in the evening, I want to have time to drink. So all this stuff, but I finally, when it got bad enough, had to surrender. And for me, that surrender, there's kind of a paradox in that, because I think sometimes when we surrender, it means giving up. And I think especially in our society that that's something we don't like to do. We don't like to surrender per se, because it indicates somehow weakness. And I think with addiction, that's the paradox, because surrender is really an acceptance, which go together, is really the ultimate act of admitting that we're powerless over something, but it opens a doorway to great gifts. And actually, I found, and I think most recovering addicts find, a great deal of freedom after that surrender, because they're freed of the addictive behavior and the craziness and the drama that goes with it. But that surrender for me is like walking through a door. When I first did it, you don't know what's on the other side, and it takes really an act of courage and a leap of faith to kind of move forward into the unknown. And it is an unknown, and it's scary. And I think people have a lot of trouble at that threshold of that door, where they get close, they may see they have a problem, and for whatever reason, whether it's entanglement with family or for their own personal reasons, they kind of back away. And sometimes in the old days of AA, when I got sober, we don't say it so much anymore, but they used to say, maybe people just need to go out and do more research. Like they have to go out and drink or drug a little bit more and see how that works for them. And that may be true, because some people may not be exactly ready, but I always worry, because there's no guarantees if you go out to do more research, you're going to get back. And I've seen many people, I've lost many people who didn't get back, both clients and friends. And I think especially these days with the drugs that we have on the streets, with the opioids and the very strong amphetamines that are much more toxic and deadly. I joke about, methamphetamine in the good old days was just plain old meth. Now it's like this super meth, but it's bad around the clock. So I think we have to really be careful about that, pushing people to do more research. There's an analogy I use that with surrender, if you're in an elevator going down, I think any addict, it gets worse. We draw lines in the sand and we cross it, and we do behaviors that we think we would never do, and we lie to our partners and continue going. And I think you're in an elevator going down. Once we understand the direction of the elevator, we can get off at the 20th floor, we can get off at the 10th floor, or we can ride it all the way down. But I think it's really important to understand, once you're have these clues that you're an addict, to really own that and surrender. So what does that take? It takes willingness. It takes willingness to walk through that door, to take a leap of faith, to maybe look at those things we don't want to see about ourselves. But the other thing it takes is a willingness to feel whatever comes up. And every addict, their addictive behavior, and oftentimes the partners as well, who are caught up in these addictive cycles, they're really numbing, or what we would say dissociating, from uncomfortable feelings. I had a bunch of those. I had a bunch of family stuff and personal stuff that I just hadn't wanted to deal with. And my addiction was a way to just kind of dissociate with that, get a little moment of, I won't say peace. Certainly it was not peaceful, but it was an escape. It was an escape out of the problems in my life. And so if I give up my coping mechanism, which is alcohol or drugs, I'm going to have those feelings, and they pop up. And I think, so that for me, the surrender piece is not just for the addictive behavior, but to also surrender my defenses against feeling those feelings, which are necessary. But it's hard, it's painful, because oftentimes there's a lot of sadness. I had a lot of grief. There's a lot of acceptance that goes with situations. But we can't start to feel those if we're in active addiction. So I think that a surrender is a big piece of that willingness. And the other piece I alluded to in the first, early on, was admitting powerlessness. And that's, I think, the big struggle of a lot of addicts who still think that they can control it. There's those stages of grief with bargaining and, I tried that myself. If I only drink or drug on weekends, or if I only drink beer instead of liquor, or, we make all these kind of compromises that usually don't work. And in fact, almost always don't work. But if someone is in that stage of not quite being in surrender, it's really hard to convince them that the same behaviors they've done before are going to lead to the same results addictively, unless they really accept that surrender and that powerlessness they have. So I guess I'll just close with that. There's this paradox I just want to reinforce that it took me a while to understand, but by giving up control over my addiction, by surrendering to it, I actually gained freedom of life. I gave up my need to control something that was totally out of control anyway. And what I gained in return was my life. I gained feeling uncomfortable feelings too. That came with a package, but I felt them and moved on. And now that's history. I'm not living with it over and over again. So it's a process. It's difficult. It takes courage. It takes support. I could not do it. I think any addict can do it by themselves. I think that sometimes they need people in their lives to reflect back to them what they see, what those people see. And sometimes that's the only way an addict can see what their behavior is, because it's really hard on the inside to really, you're kind of in a bubble. It's really hard to figure that out. So I guess I'll surrender with that. Surrender my time.
Thanks, David. You reminded me of a close friend of mine who's, I don't want to take his inventory, but he's an active alcoholic. I love him dearly. I've known him forever. And he was very supportive of me when I was crunching rock bottom. I will always love him for that, but I wish he would quit drinking. And he's a mirror for me, for my behavior back in the day. A couple of months ago, he said, "Oh, I've cut my drinking in half." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's good." Thinking non-alcoholics don't feel the need to cut their drinking in half, number one. And number two, his way of doing it was he doesn't drink before dinner anymore. And I thought, it's just that these are the things that you talk about our attempts to control.
Right.
I wanted to control my drinking, my drugging, my sexual behaviors. And that was completely out of control. And I was using those things. What I was really trying to control, which you hit on very, very, very well, was my feelings. I didn't want to feel anything, and I had to surrender my attempt to run the show because I couldn't do it. They use the word paradox. One of the sayings I hear is, the paradox of 12-step recovery is surrender to win.
Right.
You can't win unless you surrender. This disease beats us every time until we surrender and say, you know what, disease, you won, and I have to go in a different direction, because there is no controlling an addiction. We've got a couple.
Right. And I would just, I think the feeling that a lot of people have is fear. That's what I had, is just fear of what's after this. And what have I done? And what am I going to feel? And although I was miserable and afraid in my addiction, it was a familiar kind of terrible situation. And I wanted to stick to that because I was afraid of what might come next. Yeah.
We have a comment here. It says, thank you for the gentle way you articulate that. I hope the addicts are listening. So I assume that's from the partner. Yeah. What I was talking about for me was denial, really. I mean, my denial was that I could control something that was so far beyond my ability to control it. I had so many reasons and excuses. It was bizarre. And I did not want to surrender anything. And you might be able to relate to this or not, David, but I'm one of those addicts who basically everything I had was gone by the time I crunched rock bottom. And when I came back, I thought that I wanted the same life I had. And I have none of it except, I have a good relationship with my family now, which so much better than the bad relationship I had before. There is literally one friend from that era who thoroughly supports my recovery. Well, another one who's still drinking, but thoroughly supports my recovery. I had to just give up the people, the places, and the things to get sober and stay sober.
Yeah, yeah, that was certainly true for me too, Scott. I was in denial where the last thing to go was going to be my addiction, and I remember thinking this too. I'd much rather have a mental illness than be an addict. Maybe I'm depressed, or probably was depressed, but anything but owning that addiction, any other sort of stigmatized label. For me, the last thing to go was my job, because that was the thing that kept everything rolling forward. And that was my denial system too. I said, well, I never ever missed a day of work. And that was true, but I'm sure I was not at my best when I would roll in and kind of have my head down on the desk. So yeah, we have a way of fooling ourselves in a big way. And that's why I think it's so important to have people reflect back to us. And it's very difficult sometimes for partners to do that either, because they're caught up in the system of trying to help, and they have their own set of fears about what might happen. So yeah, it's difficult, but I just can't emphasize enough. I think the denial piece, it's urgent that people really try to break through that, because it's lethal. People are dying out there a lot, and it kills me that that's happening. Yeah.
Everyone, feel free to ask questions. Use the Q&A feature. You can use the chat feature if you want. You mentioned a second ago, David, that you were probably depressed. How common is that when somebody comes into recovery that they're also manifesting depression, anxiety, some form of mental illness, bipolar? How often do those things travel hand in hand, and how is that handled in treatment settings?
That's a great question. So I think almost any addict in the beginning, when they're bottoming out, could be diagnosed with a number of different things. Almost certainly major depressive disorder, depression, almost certainly anxiety. And I think a lot of addiction, almost all of addiction, is rooted in trauma. And I think so there's a great deal of trauma reactions, whether we call that post-traumatic stress or not, is one thing. But if you think about the drug use, almost every drug chemically is a depressant of some sort. Even the stimulants ultimately destroy the system that regulates mood, and they cause depression. So I think almost everybody has some level of depression when they come into treatment, and anxiety. I think it goes hand in hand. The rule of thumb is if somebody is in early recovery, it's a real mistake to try to diagnose them or even assess them for any kind of mental illness. If I'm working with a methamphetamine client who comes in and they're paranoid and hallucinating and really not thinking clearly, they might meet the criteria for schizophrenia, but let them clean up for 2 weeks and get the drugs out of their system and get some food and get hydrated. Suddenly they're not exhibiting those symptoms anymore. So it's really you have to be very cautious to not just jump to a conclusion of a mental illness or mental health disorder. However, I think it is common for any addict to meet the criteria for a lot of depressive disorders. I certainly was. And by the way, with the way addiction works in the brain, it's not a quick rebound for some drugs, like the stimulants. Meth particularly really impact the brain. They kind of destroy the wiring in a way that the brain has to kind of regenerate those pathways. And that can take months or years sometimes. And that will affect people's mood as well. The other thing addiction does that is in that regard is it affects the connections with the frontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that helps us make good decisions and think clearly and predict bad outcomes and control impulses. And so a lot of people in early recovery are extremely impulsive, which means they lack the impulse control if they get triggered to resist. And that's a brain thing. It's not willpower. So it's something that has to be recognized. So that's a long way of answering. There's a lot of different mental health impact we see with addiction, but I think it takes time once somebody gets in recovery to actually diagnose them. That being said, I'll add one more thing. And I'm not a big pill pusher normally, but I think in many cases, some kind of antidepressant is really useful for people in early recovery. And that's something to discuss with your healthcare provider. But there's a lot of antidepressants that are not addictive, that are not mood altering, that interact well with other medications that are safe. And so that often helps people in those early months, especially.
Yeah, I think a lot of people before active addiction sets in are dealing with depression and or anxiety or whatever. That was certainly the case for me. I had a lifetime of really bad anxiety and depression, sort of that cyclical, ongoing, chronic depression, comes and goes. And my addiction was self-medicating a lot of that. And therefore, when I got sober, those problems didn't go away. I had to deal with them through medication and therapy and things like that. Other people, they get depressed because their lives fall apart while they're an addict. It's a situational depression, and it tends to go away when the addiction goes away and their lives sort of get back on track. So it can go in either direction, in my experience.
And I'll share just a personal thing. I got sober in my 20s. And I was a gay man who I was in the closet. I couldn't come out. I couldn't come to terms with it myself. And that's really a lot of my drinking was about, to numb those feelings and not worry about it. And so I gave up alcohol and drugs, but then I had to deal with all those feelings and the coming out piece. And I think I was depressed certainly for a long time after that. But with therapy and program, we get through those things. And it was just getting worse. I mean, I would have died if I'd kept going the way I did. Yeah.
And you mentioned program. 12-step recovery helps my depression more than anything because that's where I feel connected, and my depression centers around feeling apart from rather than a part of. So anyway, we've got some questions. The first one here is a comment. When I was drinking, I had a rule that I wouldn't drink before 9 p.m. and most of the time I was able to keep that. I did try and cut the drinking down, but couldn't. The weird thing is I wouldn't take Motrin because I drank. I finally gave my addiction to my higher power. Surrendering is an awesome topic. I love that you didn't take Motrin.
Great. And I love the goddess thing too. I have a goddess myself. So yeah, it's funny what we do, right? And that kind of says the priority. You really summed it up beautifully. So everything went overboard before my addiction. Including other medication that I might need, self-care, relationships, people, things, hobbies. I mentioned that one of my rationalizations when I was drinking was that I needed something to love and to love me. So I needed a pet. And so I got a cat. And you can imagine the cat reflected my craziness. And, galloping around the house and climbing on blinds and really being destructive of stuff. And I joke, we needed a program called Allopet for the pets of addicts. But yeah, I mean, everything goes before the drugs. So I'm glad your process was progressive and surrendering.
Where I live in Palm Springs, we have a huge meth problem here. And one of the things that almost every meth addict will try before he or she tries to get sober is getting a pet. And the animal shelter tries very, very hard to screen, if somebody's coming in and they're a little jitter, they're just tweaking, they won't. But, they sober up, they go in, they get a pet, the pet comes back a month later because,
Wow, I didn't realize that was like a thing out there.
It's totally a thing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's totally a thing.
Yeah.
We've got a question. How did you finally come to surrender your shame from the addiction and not take it out on your family? This is from a porn and sex addict.
Wow. Yeah, I would say the two biggest things that I had to deal with was fear and shame. And shame probably priority over what I did. My life was just layers of secrets, the compartmentalizing. This person knew this bit about me, that person knew that bit, and all that was a defense against shame. And the belief that if they really knew who I was, I'd be unlovable, I'd be rejected, I'd be banned, I'd be hurt, physically abused, whatever. So I think that it's the fear of other people's reactions, of course. So I think the shame is something that really takes a while to deal with because it's so deep. Shame, remember, is not something we're born with. Shame is something that is taught to us, and that internalized shame, at least. And sometimes it serves a purpose, right? If we're a sex addict or porn addict, shame is a signal. All feelings are signals to us that they're like indicators, like this is not right. The problem is it can be crippling in recovery as well. And I think that's when we really have to deal with it and talk about it and reflect. And I think I'll use a word that is in our company name, which is integrity. And for me, resolving that shame is just being honest with myself, owning what I'd done. And the steps, by the way, provide a really nice framework for this because it talks about surrender, acceptance, and then taking inventory and then making amends over time. And I think that's how I dealt with shame is I kind of owned my problem. I was honest with myself. Also, by the way, shame, there's a kind of misplaced, I like the word humility, so I don't want to use that, but shame is kind of very ego driven, right? Shame was like, it's all about me. And in a way that I didn't have an inflated ego or I wasn't boastful, but shame was almost the flip side of that, where I was like, oh, poor me, I'm such a terrible person. Nobody's going to want me, nobody's going to like me. It was kind of a victim thing. So
you're a piece of shit, but you're the world's biggest piece of shit. So
right.
Be proud of that, yeah.
Right. So I think to really kind of get honest about all that, and that's, again, to go back, I could not do that by myself. I could not figure that out. I needed people, program people that love me, partners, friends, who would be honest with me. And I needed to be able to receive the message. And that took time. But basically, honestly, for me, it was, I tested people. I revealed things about myself in a safe way that I had never been able to say to before, to test what's the reaction going to be. And, nobody ran screaming from the room. Nobody said, oh my God, what a horrible person you are. They just sat there and listened and they heard me. And gradually I kind of worked that stuff out by being witnessed and being accepted and not in a way that made excuses for what I did, because it's really important to own and be responsible for what we do. But I think it's also, at some point, it's not productive to feel shame about that. It's almost never productive. We have to let that go and own it and move on. And Scott, you probably have insight about that too.
Yeah, David was talking basically about shame that motivates you to change is healthy shame, and the shame that keeps you stuck in the cesspool is toxic shame. Brene Brown prefers terms like guilt, which is, oh, I did something wrong, I feel bad about it, I think I'll change my behavior. Guilt is a really healthy emotion to feel. And then she talks about shame, which is what her predecessors have called toxic shame, which is, I'm a horrible person, I behave badly because I'm a horrible person, there's nothing I can do about it, I might as well just give up. Guilt motivates change. Shame keeps you stuck in the nastiness. David actually, he nailed it on both of the things that I've done to help me with shame. One of them is working the steps, particularly steps 4 through 9. Inventory through amends, those steps. And then step 10 is steps 4 through 9, wrapped all into one, and you do it every day. It's amazing how many rocks I dropped out of the pack that I was carrying, working steps 4 through 9, and I continue to drop them as things come up. The other thing that I did was, I have some ugly little secrets, and I had made some friends in recovery and was getting close to them, and I sat them all down and said, okay, here are all my secrets. One of the guys laughed and said, he spent his first year, every time he got a chip, he gave up a secret. And by the time he got to a year, he had gotten through all his dirty secrets.
That's great.
And he said, nobody ran screaming and that was it for me. I told all my friends, all the dirt, and one of them said, okay, well, that's nice. Let's go to lunch. It's just like, okay, cool. People don't run screaming from the room. I always appreciate it when somebody trusts me enough to tell me something they're ashamed of. Um, and people seem to appreciate it when I trust them enough. And it really does take a lot of the power away. David mentioned early on, we're not natural born with shame. We learn it. We get shame from other people. We also get rid of our shame with other people.
I want to mention too, I just had the pleasure of working the past couple of weeks directly with Rob Weiss out here. And he said something I thought was so great, that if you're in that kind of super shame place where I'm such a horrible person, in that really deep, dark place, that's a dead end. There's no productive value to that. There's no value at all in being there. That's not going to get you anywhere. It's just nowhere. It's a cycle that you get stuck in and trapped. There's no way out. And so I think you have to kind of take these steps that Scott and I have been talking about to kind of move out of it.
Yeah, it's quicksand if you don't take steps to address it.
Yeah.
So another question here. Are the impacts on the brain and mental health for those that are in early recovery from sex addiction similar to those from substance addiction? As we talked about earlier.
That's a great question, and it's something that is right up my alley for sure. So yes, the short answer is yes, emphatic yes. What we know now, because we can look at the brain, is that especially stimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine, the brain handles those very similarly to porn and sex addiction. And so there's a huge amount of similarities between the two. Both kind of hijack what we call the reward system, where we get rewards for food and belonging and loving someone and community and sex. And those sex addiction, porn addiction, and stimulants take that system and hijack it so that none of that gives any pleasure at all. The only pleasure we can get are these very, what we call super stimulants, the things that they're really hot fantasies, or the super amount of drugs or drugs combined with sex, what we call stacking, where people do, the drugs aren't doing it by themselves, the porn isn't doing it, let's combine them. And it kind of has this cumulative effect. So yes, the two are very similar. And I think, the American medical community is kind of behind the times, recognizing sex addiction as an addiction. The rest of the world has with the, what we call the ICD, but we'll catch up. But we have physical evidence, scientific evidence of brain scans and how it works. And by the way, the recovery process is similar as well, in that it takes time. The methamphetamine, amphetamines, and prescription Adderall, I worry a lot about college kids who are just eating Adderall like crazy, and sex and porn addicts all have a very similar trajectory of recovery, because that reward system has been so distorted. It takes time to kind of reboot or reset, whatever term you like for your brain. It has to kind of, it's a brain trauma, if you will, and the way it affects the neural pathways and the dopamine receptors, it takes time to recover. So patience, and really having an understanding of that it's going to take time to feel like yourself again, to be able to read, to be able to concentrate. All that stuff is, the other thing they have in common is just a practical bit of information, is that they both increase sensitivity to visual triggers. And so meth addicts, cocaine addicts, sex and porn addicts are all highly sensitive to any kind of visual triggering. So it can be a sexy person on the street, or someone in shorts, or if you go to the beach, that's like out of bounds for many people because it's so triggering. Sometimes seeing someone getting an injection or getting your blood drawn, all that stuff is all linked, and it takes time to kind of let your brain disconnect all those things from a triggering event for the addiction.
Yeah, I mean, addicts, we talk about getting a hit, whether it's from, a drug or alcohol or porn or whatever, we get a hit. And I always picture a hammer hitting the reward center of my brain and, squirting out pleasure. But at the same time, the poor reward center just gets mushed. And it takes a long, it's like a bruise. It takes a while to go away. I mean, that's how I picture it. I'm sure David knows way more about what the brain actually looks like.
Scientifically accurate, but no, it's a great illustration. And I'll just add that when that pleasure stuff is squirted out, very quickly, there's no more of that pleasure juice left. The brain is depleted of dopamine, and it takes time to restore that as well. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, we start producing less dopamine, and we reduce the number of dopamine centers, that receive the dopamine. They kind of have to plug into the socket. Dopamine has to plug into the socket before we feel pleasure, so the brain can work on either end of that equation.
Right.
And, it takes us time to adjust. It took me a couple of years to start to feel like I was back to being myself again in terms of being able to laugh and enjoy life.
There's a condition, the medical term is anhedonia, but it just means an inability to experience pleasure. Like nothing is pleasurable. Everything's kind of gray and sad and slow. It takes lack of energy. And that is typical of early recovery for sex addicts and porn addicts and amphetamine addicts. It's because the brain wiring has been disturbed. And it's true that chemically they're having trouble experiencing pleasure. That's where an antidepressant can often help for those circumstances, but it takes time. And Scott, I'm going to absolutely steal that metaphor because I like it with the hammer and the brain.
It's all yours.
Okay.
All yours. I picture a big rubber mallet, actually, but
I like it. Okay.
Somebody popped in here earlier with the question, and I typed back, but what she had, it was more of a comment. This individual said all of his or her relationships were sort of riddled with sex addiction, and I typed back, your own or the other person's, or, and the other possibility is both, which actually brings up a question for me. Do sex addicts attract sex addicts, or do sex addicts attract addicts, or do addicts attract sex, is there an do we reap what we sow, or whatever that phrase is?
I'd say yes. In terms of an addict and an addict, that's often the case because it's almost selective choosing who we partner with, and it's not conscious sometimes, but oftentimes if I'm drinking a lot, I'm kind of self-conscious around people who aren't drinking as much as I am, and I kind of start to hang out with them less. Or if I'm someone who uses sex and drugs together, I'm going to gravitate toward other people who do that. So we kind of draw in people that are very similar to us, mostly I think out of embarrassment because we're aware that our stuff is not normal. But I have had people too that who just, because their social circle is only other people who do what they do, believe, well, everybody's doing it. That's a barrier for recovery. Like everybody has, a lot of drinks on Friday night. Why can't I? But well, not everybody does. But in their world, it's probably true. For partners, I think, there's a natural attraction. We have this phrase we use sometimes, kind of magnetic couples, where you're drawn. You see somebody across a crowded room, and they're really interesting and appealing to you. You don't quite know why, and subconsciously, there's stuff going on there, right? We attract people into our lives. We're drawn to people's lives. And I think oftentimes there's a lot of wounding that's happened in the lives of both people. And this is not conscious, but I think sometimes people feel this partner, this person is something that could help me maybe soothe that pain or fix that wound. And what often happens is that we just get re-wounded, both parties, both the partners and the addict, because that's not a setting where those old wounds can be really healed in a way. So I think, there's a dynamic. It's with partners and addicts, oftentimes they fit together really easily, and it's remarkably comfortable at first. And I've been in some relationships like that where, wow, this is incredible. I feel like I know this person, and yeah, I do. I know the type, and it was an unhealthy one, but we're drawn to that. And I think it's not the partner's fault. It's until I deal with what's going on with me, I'm going to continue to kind of end up in those relationships. I've had many clients who we've worked really hard to get out of a bad, even abusive relationships. And they get out, and 6 months later they're in another one with a different person, but the same thing. So I think until we heal some of those early wounds, some of those, and become conscious of what we're putting out, what we need, what we think we need, we're going to keep getting those attractions that come to us without really our conscious awareness. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not muted anymore. I completely agree with that. The person who made that comment earlier touched back just me in terms of being the sex addict, and then added, they appreciate my attention, meaning the other people. And that is also my experience as an active sex addict. I could pick out the neediest person in the room and give them the attention they needed to get what I wanted. I mean, I could walk in the room and be like, you are the victim. Let's go. And Dr. Rob and I have sort of joked, you know, sex addicts promise love to get sex. Love addicts promise sex to get love. And sex and love addicts often end up together because, or, you know, not necessarily love addicts, but, you know, people who are searching for connection, probably because they didn't get it when they were young, you know, or people who got too much connection. You know, I had, you know, a horribly enmeshed mother relationship, and everything feels icky to me. You know, even today, I'm still dealing with that. But I wanted the sex and I wanted to be wanted, but, you know, and I would promise you the world and then drop you off the cliff. That was my pattern. So, yeah. Dr. Rob puts, I think it's in the final chapter of Codependence, which is his book for partners. He talks about twos don't marry eights. And he's talking about, you know, Harvey Weinstein is an exception, being married to Georgina Chapman, who's a beautiful woman. And he's a total gross frog, but, you know, he had lots of money and career advance. So normally, you know, Dudley Moore would not hook up with Bo Derek in the movie 10, normally. So we naturally do that with looks, but we can also do it really unconsciously with emotions and psychology. I mean, I grew up in an unhealthy household. I am not going to be attracted to somebody who's perfectly healthy because they're just going to bore the crap out of me. There won't be enough drama. There won't be enough push-pull. There, you know, it just won't be what I'm accustomed to.
That's such a great point, because I think people often are looking around the room and we want to find that perfect, loving, mentally healthy person. But I think in our initial, as an addict, we skip them over because they look boring. You know, there's no drama there, or no potential. I really, that's so true.
And the other issue is not knowing how to connect with that person. I know how to connect with somebody who's needy. I got that down. And I know how to connect because of my father with somebody who's like me. Because he's like, and he wasn't a sex addict, but, you know, he was just emotionally disconnected. That's what I know. So the question here from this individual, yes, this keeps happening. How do I heal?
So we're talking about a partner who keeps getting these relationships.
Yeah, this individual's a sex addict and keeps getting into.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I think, how do I heal? I think the first essential step is a timeout from relationships, right? I think it's, and that's why that's emphasized very strongly in the recovery programs, is to not jump into something right away, because we just replicate that historically damaging pattern. So I think it's really important to just take a time out. And for me, the healing has to happen internally. You have to start to love yourself. And I think oftentimes sex addicts and addicts in general don't have a lot of love or positive self-regard, and they're looking for that from other people. And that's that kind of radar we have. I think we can hone in on a needy person or whatever, that's that perfect fit where my neediness matches their needing to give or without receiving often. So anyway, to me, the pattern is interrupt it. take a break and really work on yourself. And I think that the key there, because so many addicts approach this with a lot of negative judgment about themselves. And I think it's so important to have that whole process with self-compassion and to really, we were running a group today and somebody said they're doing a timeline of their addictive history and the impact it had on their family. And he said, he looked at it, he was kind of shocked basically at the patterns. And he said, my God, I'm a horrible person. I've done horrible things. And I stopped him. I said, no, you're a good person who's done horrible things. Right? We internalize that, the bad things we've done, and I'm not minimizing those. They're bad, then they impact people, they hurt people. But I think in recovery especially, we're not necessarily bad people. We've done bad things, but we're good people. I think we have to have that compassion for ourselves to heal, and to somehow separate this addictive, destructive behavior from my heart, from who I am, and really find that the goodness in there and forgive. I think long after I forgave anybody else, was I able to forgive myself. That was like the last one. And I regret that, because it really should have come early on, because that would have enabled me to heal and make some healthy connections much sooner.
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think you just froze up on us, David, but I think most addicts, the last person we forgive is ourselves. That's part of, getting rid of the shame. One of the things, to take it back to our topic of the day, surrender. I had to surrender early on my need for constant validation, my desire for my need to be wanted, in that way or any way, and to be praised for whatever. I had to surrender that. And that meant, walking away from sex and relationships for a good long while. And then I worked on having friendships, non-sexual friendships that were supportive, with people who knew all the dirt, which I just told you about earlier. And somewhere along the way, I learned to love myself. I mean, sometimes in AA meetings is where I hear this. Those people will say, oh, our job is to love you until you can love yourself, which used to make me want to throw up. But it's just like, oh, get away from me, you're creepy. But now I get it. We don't love ourselves when we enter recovery. We really don't. I hated myself. I hated you almost as much as I hated me. Not quite. But I didn't know that at the time. It took me a long time to understand that. A follow-up comment to that. I've never lived for myself ever. Not dating now, in counseling, but doing hookups for dopamine and relief, only on the weekends. I know, bad idea.
Yeah, that's not an uncommon thing. I think people know, any addict, whether they're a sex addict or a drug addict, knows what's kind of give them a little buzz, give them the shot of dopamine that we so crave. And by the way, an addict is not even seeking that so much for the high after a while, but just to feel normal, right? It's like we've dug a hole and just, I need a fix just to kind of get back and feel okay. It's not even so much for the great buzz. So it's kind of a maintenance kind of thing that's going on. Here's for dopamine. I'm all for dopamine and feeling good. I think it's really important to take a look at how you're getting your dopamine, and to continue, if you're a sex addict, continue even sporadic hookups keeps that whole addictive process alive and well, even if it's maybe less than before or something, but it's still there. It's like my meth clients who don't use drugs, but masturbate with meth porn or meth fantasies. They still need that drug connection, not ingesting the drug, but their addiction is very much alive in their heads. So I'd caution you, and you know this, you said, I know, not wrong. So to beware of that, and to start to look for alternative sources of dopamine. What else gives you pleasure? And I had to learn that stuff. And, for me early on, I was like, boring, but, take a walk. I connect with the sky. If I'm really like crazed, I have to go up and kind of see blue in clouds, or be conscious of planting your feet in the earth, or pet your dog or your cat, or take a walk, a mindful walk where you go out and just kind of notice the trees. And I'm out in California now, and noticing the bloom. I was at a place where the beautiful wildflowers blooming in the mountains. So just being aware. So I think we need dopamine. We absolutely need it. But we need to really be cautious about how we get it. That's like a quick, easy fix that you're going to pay a price for. By the way, for me, I think the biggest source of dopamine, besides those things I mentioned, was connection. You know, to have a sense of belonging. And the places I belong were meetings. Those are the only places I belonged for a long time. But knowing that I could walk in and kind of feel at home. And by the way, that's translatable. You know, I've been to meetings out here. They're not my home groups, but I walk in the door of a meeting I've never been to, and I feel at home. And that gives me a little shot of dopamine. So yeah, maybe expand your sources of dopamine release. We need it, but it's not a good thing to do it like you're doing. You know that. But
yeah, I'd go back. I mean, refer you back to the mallet bruising the reward center in your brain. You know, you're not given it time to heal. And I always try to get my sponsees to quit cigarettes too, because David can tell you, nicotine is a huge dopamine hit. And,
right.
You know, they're trying to normalize their brain, and 20 times a day, they're whacking it, you know, with a hammer again. So,
right.
So, yeah.
And then I see there's a follow-up comment there that working out at the gym and swimming helps, but too short a time. Working out is a great way, not only for the immediate effect of feeling good, but it actually helps the brain heal. It speeds up the healing of the brain. But I would, you know, I'm not sure where you're at in the recovery stage, but I think it's important to just recognize that your normal life may not have that dopamine hit that you get from sex or hookups, and that you need to allow the brain to reset. And I think you have to need to trust that you will experience pleasure, probably better pleasure than you've ever had on drugs or sex, if you allow it to reset and experience sex that's healthy. And I hate that word, but sex that's not addictive.
Yeah. I am early in my sex addiction recovery, I carried around my outer circle behaviors, my outer boundary behaviors. That, for those of you who don't know, inner boundary is bottom line addictive behaviors. I can't do this, or this. If I do those things, I'm not sober. The middle boundary, or the middle circle, depending on what program you're in, is slippery behaviors, thoughts, emotions, people, you know, keeping secrets, skipping meetings, not going to therapy, things like that. Slippery. Driving through a certain neighborhood, very slippery. You know, keeping secrets about anything, very slippery. The outer boundary is, you know, I was spending 30 to 40 hours a week in my addiction. I had to replace that with something.
Right.
My outer boundary it basically was a list of things that I used to enjoy, you know, movies, books, cats. I'm a big cat fan. I have a cat sleeping on my windowsill right now. You know, working around the house, you know, I had a list of things that I knew at one point in my life I had enjoyed, you know, going to ball games, you know, playing softball. And I just forced myself to do those things, even though I couldn't really enjoy them. They didn't give me enough of a dopamine hit to even get me back to feeling normal. But I forced myself to do those things over and over and to connect with people, which was very hard. You know, for somebody who was, you know, running from connection his whole life, it's very hard. And like David said, that's that for today. If I'm feeling down, I pick up the phone and I call one of my friends and I connect, because it fixes it immediately. And all these things that I had enjoyed when I was, you know, before the addiction set in, that I lost the enjoyment during the addiction and the early part of recovery, I now enjoy more than ever, most of them. And that's going to go on my gratitude list tomorrow, actually, now that I think about it. But it took time. It took me a couple years. Like I said, it took me a couple years to feel back to baseline.
Yeah. And that's kind of the good news. The good news is that you return to baseline, but the bad news, it takes time. It does take time. And many of us have spent years in our addiction, so makes sense that it's going to take some time to recover. The one thing I'd add about, you're very conscious about using sex for the dopamine hit and hookups and stuff, but I'd also suggest you take a look at what's really going on. I think it's probably not about sex. I think it's about the dopamine allows you to numb or escape from maybe some feeling you don't like, or some activity or boredom or whatever it is. But I would really look at the sex is the medicine, and you're kind of abusing the medicine. But I think you have to kind of go back and look, what's the real problem going on underneath it, to take a look.
Yeah, part of their comment is sex is the only time I feel loved.
Yeah. So there's that need for connection and validation and to be loved, which is great. I mean, those things are all wonderful. It's just addicts tend to go about it in unhealthy ways or self-destructive ways.
Yeah, and when we're not feeling that way, we want to feel that way because, so that's natural to want to feel that way, but there are other ways to get that feeling. It just may take a while before they give you the dopamine hit that you're looking for.
And I just want to say with love addicts, there's this thing called limerence, which is this biochemical state when you first fall in love with somebody where you're totally infatuated and you're sending 40 texts a day and you're, I've talked about this before, it's not quite stalking, or maybe you are stalking, I don't know, but you're just obsessed. And that's a really intense mood altering state. And after a while, with a couple months in a relationship, that usually fades as we normalize and the relationship moves on to another stage. But sometimes people feel they get addicted to that intoxicating state and they go from one relationship to another, looking for that validation and love and that high of being connected and falling in love. But then they can't sustain their relationship, the intimacy piece.
Well, David, we got a couple minutes left. Do you want to say anything more about surrender to wrap us up and take us out? Or?
Yeah, so I think for me, and I think for all addicts, it's the surrender piece is a really act of courage and desperation. I think I didn't surrender until I had no other option. And I have seen clients and friends who lost everything and even at physical death hadn't surrendered. And so, I mean, it's possible to just go all the way down and crash and burn. But hopefully people see where like that elevator analogy, where it's going. And I think we don't have to wait till we lose everything. We can see the patterns and the trends and jump on board and the recovery train and take a different look. But it takes an act of faith too. It's walking through a door. We're giving up our protective cloak. And my addiction for me was the walls. It was defenses. It was everything that kind of protected me. And to sort of take that off and to give up my coping mechanisms, although they were killing me, is a difficult thing. And I think we have to recognize how difficult that is. But it's an essential step. And the rewards are incredibly great compared to the horror I was living in before. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Great conversation, people. Thank you.
Yeah, this was great. Just a reminder, we do have Treatment Center open in LA, and we'll be opening in Thailand in May. I don't know. I'll get the official date and let everyone know. When we're offering treatment for adult male sex addicts and adult male with paired substance use and sexual behaviors. And those programs are designed by Dr. Fawcett and Dr. Rob Weiss. So
great.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you. David will be back here in 2 weeks. Miro Worosky will have his gay men's discussion group next week.
Okay, everybody. Thank you. Good night. Take care. See you next week, Scott.
Okay, I'll see you.